The island of Sumatra is the only place where the endangered Sumatran tigers manage to hang on for dear life. There are less than 400 left in the wild, unlike their cousins, the Bali and Javan tigers that have already died out completely. Sumatra is doing all they can to keep them safe, but this is proving to be an uphill battle. Between the 60 million inhabitants of the country and the ever-expanding cities and farmlands, their living space is getting less and less. Inevitably, humans and wild animals can't avoid running into each other from time to time. The difference between Sumatran tigers and the more famous Siberian tiger is mostly their size. Siberians clock in at over 600 pounds, sometimes more, but the Sumatran tiger reaches between 400 and 500 pounds. But make no mistake, the slight difference in size doesn't make the Sumatran any less dangerous. And now, even in 2024, we're hearing of more and more attacks from these already terribly endangered creatures. Most of them happen on the outskirts of the jungle or on farmlands. There is nowhere else for them to hide, so where are they supposed to go? That brings us to May of 2024, when the morning dawned and the farm workers began to move out into the fields. On this acacia plantation, situated in the Riau district, it was weeding day. Workers went out in their protective masks with tanks strapped on their backs, laying down a poisonous weed-killing spray to keep the precious acacia trees safe. This plantation lies almost entirely in conservation land, set out specifically to protect the tiger's habitat. When large swatches were set out years ago, these farms already existed, and that's why they fall into conservation land to this day. These acacia plantations are so thickly grown that they resemble the jungle enough to attract animals taking shelter in the night. Finding a monkey, a peacock, or even a rare visit from a sun bear isn't all that unusual, and most people know the laws, and they and the animals usually stay out of each other's way. The day is for the humans, and the nights are for the animals, an agreement that is mostly kept peacefully between the two groups. The three men that set out had all been working on the plantation for 5 years or more. They were out just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, and the bats were still getting settled for their day's sleep, chittering off in the distance, their sounds joining the birds that were beginning to wake up to seize the daylight. Splitting off in separate directions to cover more ground, the men set off just as the animals were starting to scuttle back into the deeper jungle. The mist from the poisonous spray was irritating their sensitive noses. The noise from the pumps and the men themselves were not like those in the deep forests, making them even more nervous, but none more so than the aforementioned Sumatran tiger that had taken shelter in the crevice of a particularly big tree's roots on the far right side of the field. It slunk back deeper into its hidey hole when it heard the footsteps crunching over the leaves coming closer and closer. But unfortunately, the 26-year-old worker was rather good at his job, not missing a single tree as he moved between the rows. The tiger shrank back as far as he could go under those roots, leaving only its face barely visible from the hollow it had dug for itself the night before and the leaves and roots that added extra camouflage. When our young farm worker came by, he didn't even notice the striped orange face peering out from ground level when his hose went by. The already nervous tiger would have probably stayed right where it was until the strange human passed it, leaving the young man none the wiser that there was such a fearsome predator lying hidden just a foot away from his work boot. But that was not the case. Instead, that spray nozzle passed right over that tree's root system, giving the tiger a face full of pesticide right into its nose and eyes. The reaction was immediate. Snarling in pain and anger, it sprang from the hollow like lightning, pouncing straight onto the man in front of it. The spray had nearly blinded it, but the man was standing so close and directly in front of the animal that it just couldn't have missed, even without its eyes to detect him. When that orange blur streaked out from the ground, the man was completely caught off guard. He raised his arm instinctively in front of his face, The tiger's teeth grabbed onto his right hand, and the almost 300 pounds of beast slammed him to the ground, nearly tearing the hand away from the wrist socket when they skidded several feet on the ground, leaving a deep groove in the earth. Screaming hysterically, the man attempted to grab the tiger's head to shove it off, but it was no use. His hand was shattered, and he was already on the ground. All he managed to do was to spray the tiger's fur in a shower of blood from the profusely spurting wound on his wrist and hand. The next instant, his screams for help were cut short. The tiger had him by the throat in its death grip. All sound and air ceased to move through the man's airway. All he could do was struggle and claw at the beast on top of him. As the body of the struggling man beneath the creature began to lose his fight, becoming weaker and weaker from lack of oxygen, the tiger's eyes and nose began to clear from the stinging spray. The other two men had heard the screams for help. They dropped their equipment right where they stood and began running toward their friend without a second thought. Their heavy work boots pounded toward the scene, and they called for their colleague, alerting the animal of more approaching humans. The sheer amount of noise they were making as they ran toward him probably saved their own lives. The animal's eyes were cleared, but it was still in pain and half mad because of it. But it didn't feel like it could take on what sounded like many humans running toward it. So it took off into the trees, running toward the deeper jungle, leaving behind him a broken man lying in the leaves. When the workers arrived, he was already dead. The blood seeping into the ground was still warm. If he hadn't died from oxygen deprivation, then the wound on his neck would have bled out in seconds. His entire throat had been ripped out, leaving only tendrils and ribbons where there once was muscle and bone. Strands of orange fur were embedded beneath his nails as he tried to fight back. Authorities found the hollow and the footprints that led back into the forest. Given the evidence at the scene, this was not a tiger out to actively hunt humans, merely a terrible case of bad luck. But still they went out to search for it. No matter how few of the Sumatran tigers are left, a killer is still a killer, and it needs to be dealt with. But it seems that the creature was long gone, back in the jungle where it wants to be. Given its experience with the poisonous spray, it will probably be smart enough to avoid the acacia plantations altogether. Only time will tell, but it's unlikely that it'll ever be found. We'll know for certain in the next few weeks. As smart as tigers are, they have also been known to exclusively hunt humans after they've gotten their first taste of human flesh. And seeing how easy it can be to catch them, they just can't resist the easy meal. So now we wait and pray that this plantation worker will be the only one to meet his terrifying final affliction.
24-year-old Patricia Wyman thought she had landed her dream job. She had applied to work at Haliburton Forest and Nature Reserve in Ontario, Canada. The position was for a caretaker of the North American gray wolves. When she was accepted and welcomed onto the team, she was delighted. She had always been fascinated with the species, and working with them was going to be exhilarating. Haliburton Forest covers 100,000 acres and comprises millions of trees and more than 100 lakes. It offers members of the public ecotourism experiences in an incredible piece of Canada's wilderness. It is a sustainably managed forest which includes a research facility and education center. With the aim to educate people about wolves, they built a wolf center and introduced their first wolf pack in 1993. They have always tried to keep the wolves as wild as possible, allowing them to exhibit semi-natural behavior. There is no human interaction with the wolves, and visitors can only view them through the one-way glass. The only time they see human beings is at feeding time. Patricia had recently completed her undergraduate degree in wildlife biology in the University of Guelph in Ontario. When she arrived for her induction, her supervisor warned her of the dangers of working with wolves. They had been in captivity for their entire lives, but they were not socialized with humans. That's the way the reserve wanted it to be. The wolves were free to roam their 15-acre enclosure. When the caretaker took them their food, the wolves would hide away. They were timid and shy, just like wolves are in the wild. They kept their distance from humans and had never given the staff any reason to be overly concerned. Patricia was introduced to her work routine, which included educating the public, giving talks, and caring for the wolf pack. She was taken into the wolf enclosure and shown where to feed them. The following day, she was tasked with feeding them alone. As Patricia unlocked the gate and stepped inside, she felt an uneasy feeling wash over her. She looked around but couldn't see any of the wolves. She walked purposefully to spot where she dumped the food. She set it down, but when she turned to leave, she noticed the alpha male watching her. The way he was standing sent alarm bells ringing. The hairs on the back of Patricia's neck stood on end. He wasn't timid like the rest of them. He was eyeing up this new member of staff. He was sizing her up. His manner was odd, and something about him unsettled Patricia. When she returned home that evening, she recalled her day's events to her fiancé. She was excited about her new role, but also mentioned her apprehension when it came to the alpha male in the pack. Although Patricia had clearly been unsettled by this particular wolf, she didn't share her concerns with her supervisor. Being new, perhaps she didn't want to cause a fuss. Maybe she was wrong about him anyway. The staff at the center had never raised any concern about him before. But Patricia's instincts were right. There was something about the wolf's behavior that was worrying. Something had triggered a behavior change in him, and with her expert knowledge and understanding of wolf behavior, Patricia had noticed it. The following day, on April 18, 1996, Patricia entered the enclosure once more. This time, she wasn't there to feed the wolves. The wolves were only fed once every 5 days. In fact, no one knows why Patricia went into the enclosure on her own that day, and no one knows exactly what happened next, but Chief Investigator Eric Klinghammer came to the following conclusion. Patricia unlocked the gate to the wolf paddock. The metal framework clanged behind her, alerting the wolves to her presence. For some reason, she wanted to see them in their enclosure, but they weren't close enough to the fence. The paddock was littered with fallen trees. They lay scattered across the grass. Patricia stepped over them as she searched for the wolf pack. She had only walked through the enclosure a little distance before she came across them. 5 large adults lying down in the grass. They were already looking in Patricia's direction. They had already heard her. They had already smelt her. When they saw Patricia approach, they stood up and pricked their ears. Patricia stood still. She didn't know whether to stand and face them or retreat slowly. She had been told that they normally flee when they see a person in their territory. They were normally hesitant, but not today. As Patricia stood there, frozen to the spot, the wolves walked forwards. They started to surround her, circling her. Patricia was trapped. She must have felt fear. She must have panicked when she saw them advancing. Her adrenaline would have surged as the telltale signs of an imminent attack grew. Her heart thundered in her chest. The wolves stepped forward once more, their eyes locked onto the young woman. The alpha male approached. Patricia stepped backwards. As she did so, she tripped over a fallen tree and fell to the ground. That was all it took. One single trip, and the wolves seized the opportunity to attack. In a second, Patricia felt the weight of one of the wolves on top of her as she scrabbled about on the ground. She knew she was in big trouble. She knew this was it. She tried desperately to get up, but the wolf was joined by more. In a frenzied attack, the pack bit her all over, clamping their jaws around her legs and arms. Pulling her limbs in all directions, she felt the tearing of skin and muscle. She put up a brave fight, trying to lash out and fight them off. But there were too many of them. Each weighing up to 175 pounds or 80 kilograms, they were strong and powerful. Their sharp teeth and jaws, designed to subdue and kill their prey, can crush bone. Patricia felt herself grow weaker. As she lay there, she tried to cover her neck and head. She had no more fight left in her. She was bleeding heavily. Patricia died that day. It was only her 4th day in her dream job. Her years of study had built up to a job like this, and it ended so brutally and tragically. To their shock and horror, 2 employees of the reserve found Patricia's body that afternoon. They immediately phoned the Ontario Provincial Police, who rushed over. 2 officers drew their weapons and entered the enclosure. As they made their way over to Patricia's body, they saw the wolves standing guard. But they hadn't eaten her. A few bites had been taken from her extremities, but her torso was largely untouched. The savage attack had ripped the clothes from her, and multiple bite marks suggested at least 5 wolves had piled in on the attack. Maybe more. As the officers stepped closer, one wolf lowered its head, fixed its eyes on them, and let out a deep, menacing growl. This behavior was a sign that it was protecting its kill. The officers then noticed another wolf step forward, and then another. Gradually, the 2 policemen were being circled by wolves. They were surrounded, just as the wolves had done with Patricia. Outnumbered and not sure of the wolves' intentions, the officers fired a couple of warning shots in the air. The loud bangs shocked the wolves and sent them running. The 2 officers fled the enclosure and called for backup. When more officers arrived at the center, 6 entered the paddock to retrieve Patricia's body. They did so without further incident. The investigator, Eric Klinghammer, suggested that the reason the wolves had not eaten Patricia was because they tend to avoid unfamiliar food. His conclusions of what happened on that fateful day came from over 25 years of experience studying and working with wolves. He also had extensive knowledge of wolf behavior and attacks on humans by both wild and captive canines. It was tragic that such a young and enthusiastic woman lost her life doing what she loved. We will never know why she entered the wolf enclosure that day. Maybe she innocently wanted to observe their behavior close up, but where there are predators, there are always dangers, and this time it led to her unfortunate final affliction.
When it comes to animals in the wild, it's well known that mothers will protect their young, no matter what. Whether it's a tiny frog to a huge lion, the females of these species will do everything they can to ensure that their young live and grow up to become proper adult animals. And, as the old adage goes, one of the scariest animals that you don't want to mess with is a mama bear and her cubs. David Montoya was an 18-year-old from Hollis in Oklahoma. As a young man, he had always been unsure as to what he wanted to do when he grew up. Whilst most of his friends in his school had an idea of what they wanted to do, David was slightly less sure about how he wanted to live his life. Despite this, he was a good student in school, getting good grades. However, he sometimes found it difficult to focus on his lessons. Instead, he wished that he was outside doing something practical. When it came time for his graduation, the young man had decided that he wanted to work with his hands, as he found it a lot more interesting than sitting in an office. Seeing that there was a job going for contractors at an Idaho-based company called Timberline Drilling, David decided to go and mine silver in Alaska, as he thought that it would be the perfect opportunity to get out of Oklahoma and go traveling, whilst also getting to earn a bit of money. The salaries of silver miners in the U.S. range from $30,880 to $70,360. But David was just excited to be finally out of school and making money. Being new to the job and probably one of the youngest on the job site, David knew that he would likely be earning the lower end of the average salary. However, for a young man just out of school, $30,000 a year was a good start. After securing the job, David packed his bags and flew out of Oklahoma, excited to start his job in Alaska. Once in Alaska, the young man was taken out to the drill site, which was so remote in its location that it was only accessible via helicopter. The drill site itself was located on the edge of the Hecla Greens Creek mine property on an island in southeastern Alaska. For David, the whole experience was completely new and exhilarating. The wild landscape was something that he had never truly experienced before, especially not on the scale that Alaska boasts. The state has approximately 222 million acres of federal land, which is roughly about 60% of the state. Of that vast acreage, there are about 57.5 million acres of designated wilderness, along with some 16.5 million acres of proposed wilderness areas. Alaska's designated wilderness acreage makes up approximately 54% of the entire nation's wilderness. Considering just how much more wild the state was compared to Oklahoma, it was safe to say that David was feeling a little overwhelmed. However, the young man was determined to do well at his job. It was a very difficult and very physically demanding job, which left David feeling exhausted more often than not. But the young man enjoyed his work, and he felt that he was learning valuable life skills as he did it. Because Alaska is so wild, there are plenty of animals to be seen in the great outdoors, and one of these animals are bears. With more than 40,000 grizzly bears and 100,000 black bears roaming wild, it's not difficult at all to spot one of these amazing animals out and about. In fact, Admiralty Island is famous for its coastal grizzlies and has the densest population of bears per square mile in North America. An estimated 1,500 brown bears roam about on the island, according to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, meaning that it is common to spot one without too much trouble tracking them down. Roughly 5 months after beginning his job as a silver miner, David had gotten into quite a good routine. He would wake up early, have his breakfast, and then head off to the drill site where he would happily work, mining as much silver as he could. However, on this particular day, things didn't quite go according to plan. After working his morning shift, David was happy to finally go on break. Whilst he loved his job, it was still very exhausting, and taking a moment to relax and unwind in the fresh air was something that he always looked forward to. It was whilst the 18-year-old was wandering around the site, stretching his legs, that he stumbled across something he wished he hadn't. There, standing only a few feet in front of him, was a huge brown bear and her 2 cubs. Instantly, David froze in fear. When he had first began his job, he was made to go to a company meeting which discussed the mine's bear safety program. This included training that all workers, contractors, and visitors must complete before going to the site. Workers are taught ways to prevent bear encounters, including proper disposal of food. And, in remote locations, bear spray is among the tools employees generally bring with them in the case of bear encounters. Unfortunately for David, he had forgotten his bear spray. He also forgot the most important rule when dealing with a bear: not to make any sudden movements or noises. After noticing the bear, David quickly tried to backtrack. However, his panicked, fast movements scared the mama bear and her cubs, who thought that David was probably trying to threaten them. Not wanting her babies to get hurt, the mama grizzly rose up onto her back legs to try and make herself look more imposing before letting out a loud roar. Scared, David turned and tried to run. However, this set off the bear's hunting instinct. The huge bear charged after David, easily catching up to him as she could run as fast as 35 miles per hour. Once she had caught up to the young man, the mama grizzly began ferociously attacking him. She bit down where her teeth would reach and clawed relentlessly at his body. David was in utter agony, trying desperately to get away from the onslaught, but with a massive 600-pound bear on him, pinning him down, there was no way for him to escape. To make matters worse, the bear's cubs also ran over and began mauling David. They were learning from their mother, not understanding that attacking humans wasn't something that they should be doing. Sadly, despite David's efforts to get away, he was unable to escape the 3 bears. It wasn't long before one of the young man's co-workers went looking for David, as he was due back to work from his break. But when they found him, They couldn't believe their eyes. The mother bear and her 2 cubs were gathered around David's lifeless body, feasting on it, completely ignoring the men approaching them while they consumed David. Because they were in quite a wild place, a lot of the security at the mine site had guns. It was with these guns that the mama bear and her babies were euthanized. State troopers were then called to the island so that they could help sort out the situation. In the end, David's body was taken to the state medical examiner's office for an autopsy, where it was determined that the death was caused by the bears themselves. At first, David's co-workers were unsure if he had died from some kind of accident and the bears had found him already dead. The medical examiners were able to confirm he died of blood loss resulting from a bite to the neck. His body was then sent back to his home in Oklahoma so that his friends and family could give him a proper funeral. Everyone was devastated at the loss of David, as he was a well-liked young man who made friends with everyone he met. To make matters worse, he was only a week away from his 19th birthday when the attack took place. His family were left in shock, and they constantly miss him. However, whilst it is sad what happened to David, it is also sad how the attack was handled, with the mama bear and her 2 cubs being shot in retaliation for the attack. It is likely that the mama was simply trying to protect her babies from what she perceived to be danger. Others point to the 3 bears eating David's body to suggest the bears had mauled him as part of a predatory attack, possibly the mother bear teaching her cubs how to hunt, with the humans being the prey. If this was the case, if the bears hadn't been shot after the attack, it's likely they would have continued hunting humans, bringing more innocent people like David Montoya to their terrifying, final affliction. When we think of farming, we typically think of fields of wheat or a herd of cows. But in some parts of the world, crocodiles are farmed. They are produced not only for their meat, but for their skins and eggs as well. It is a big business in places like Cambodia, where it provides a living for many families. But unlike farming cows and sheep, this farming is a deadly game. When your livestock consider you as their prey, you know you need to be tough to survive. One wrong move, and it could be game over. Luan Nam was a veteran in the business of crocodile farming. He was 72 years old and farmed more than 40 crocodiles on his land. His farm was one of more than 900 across Cambodia, just outside Siem Reap, Cambodia's second-largest city. 60% of the kingdom's crocodile farms are situated in this region. The climate is ideal for crocodile production, but not much can be said of the conditions in which they are kept. In Cambodia, Siamese crocodiles and saltwater crocodiles are the most common species to be farmed. Hong Kong, China, and Taiwan are the biggest importers of crocodile products in the world. They consume the meat and use different body parts in traditional medicine and pharmaceuticals. More than 1 million skins are exported by crocodile farmers every year, and these are highly prized in the fashion industry. A crocodile farmer can expect a crocodile's value to be double what was paid to grow and harvest it, but prices vary across the world, and the industry in Cambodia has seen a steady decline in the value of its commercial crocodiles. In a bid to keep production costs down and cleaning to a minimum, in Cambodia, crocodiles are confined to concrete enclosures and fed dead fish, corn flour soaked in blood, and chunks of meat. It is a miserable existence for these prehistoric reptiles. Luan's family knew just how dangerous the business was. Luan had many close calls before. Keeping the highly intelligent animals in unnatural environments could drive them mad with aggression. His farm was a concrete pit. In the center, there was a rectangular freshwater pool in which the crocodiles could swim and cool off. It was green and murky. The surrounds were all made of cold, hard concrete. There was no environmental enrichment for the giant reptiles. It was a bleak environment. Steel steps led down to the ground from walkways above. Wooden planks balanced across raised concrete pillars helped Luan move around without entering the enclosure. But it was a dangerous and precarious setup. One slip and he would plummet into the concrete pit and the eagerly waiting crocodiles below. Fish that cost 50 cents per kilo were tossed from these walkways. Younger crocodiles were fed daily, but the adults usually only once a week. Although they were fed in this way, their killer instincts were still there. Fights often broke out, the overcrowded enclosure erupting into a pit of loud hisses, thrashing water, and fearsome biting matches. Luan had erected metal cages in which the female crocodiles could lay their eggs. These were a precious commodity. He sold them to other farms or on the Chinese market. But accessing the eggs could often prove challenging. The females were protective of their clutch. They would hiss at Luan if he came too close. His only form of defense was a stick that he held out in front of him. It was the only barrier between him and his deadly livestock. A crocodile's jaws can exert a force of more than 3,500 psi. They would snap the stick in half like a matchstick, but better the stick than his leg. In May 2023, Luan arrived at his farm as usual. His family had begged him for years to give up the business. They knew how dangerous it was for him, and at 72 years old, he certainly wasn't getting any younger. The prices for crocodiles and their products were steadily declining as direct markets were fluctuating and there was less demand from neighboring countries. But changing careers at that age would be difficult for Luan. He knew his business inside out, and it just about provided for his family. He took pride in being the president of the local Crocodile Farmers Association. There was no way he was giving up now. Adult females used to reach between $500 and $600, but in recent years had dropped to $150. The profitability of crocodile farming in Cambodia was dropping, but it was all Luan had ever known. A female crocodile was inside one of the metal nesting cages that morning. She was protecting her clutch when Luan arrived on the scene. The crocodiles typically laid between 20 and 60 eggs between February and May, and the hatchlings would emerge between April and July. In 2019, these babies would fetch a price of $7 to $10 per head, but by 2020, this price had dropped to just $2.50. Cambodia's crocodile farmers were barely breaking even. Each and every crocodile produced on the farm was valuable, and Luan needed to make sure that all the eggs made it to hatching. Luan climbed down the metal steps and into the enclosure, keeping his eyes on the inhabitants closely. The egg-laying cage was on a raised platform, set back from the rest of the crocodiles. As he approached the female, she hissed loudly, her mouth open, displaying all 70 of her lethal, sharp teeth. Luan hit the cage with his stick. The crocodile thrashed her tail from side to side. She was angry. Luan prodded her, and she began to move out of the cage. As she neared the edge of it, she suddenly lunged at Luan's stick. She grabbed it in her jaws and clamped down. Instinctively, Luan pulled the stick backwards, but in doing so, he lost his footing and fell. He landed on the ground of the crocodile enclosure with a heavy thud. The enormous reptiles wheeled around. All 40 of them had their eyes locked onto the small farmer. They spotted him lying helplessly on the ground, and before he had a chance to get to his feet, they ran over to him. Luan knew that he was in serious trouble. He had never been in that situation before, and he knew what was coming. In an instant, some crawled out of the water, dragging themselves onto dry land. Others, basking on the side of the pool, leapt to their feet. As they ran towards him, their tails swayed from side to side, and their short legs moved quickly underneath their enormous, heavy bodies. Their mouths were closed in their characteristic toothy grin, but as they came within striking distance, they opened, gaping wide. To them, this was fresh meat at feeding time. Before he could react, one quickly lunged forward and grabbed Luan's leg. It shook its head, shaking the man violently from side to side. He cried out and tried to reach down and release himself from the vice-like grip. But as he did so, another launched an attack, this time biting down on his arm. It violently ripped his arm from his body and swallowed it, whole, in front of him. Blood poured onto the concrete. Luan was desperate. Nobody was around to hear his cries. Nobody knew the danger he was in. Luan continued to fight back. He was losing blood. He could feel the raw power from the crocodiles as they lunged at him and bit down. Another crocodile joined the feeding frenzy and pulled Luan so hard that he felt his hip give way. He was dragged across the concrete, scraping his back as he was pulled towards the stagnant green water. Then, with an almighty splash, he was dragged in. The 40 crocodiles slid into the pool after him, each lunging at the body, pulling and tugging. One performed a death roll. Luan, now barely conscious, held his breath as he was washing machined over and over under the water. He could feel the pressure building in his leg. He could feel the intense searing pain as more and more crocodiles attacked him, taking bites out of him. But he couldn't fight any longer. He couldn't hold them off. It was a losing battle. In less than a few minutes, Luan had lost his fight. His body lay limp in the water. Swirls beneath the surface and splashes around his limbs continued. The green water turned red as the crocodiles feasted, tugging at the corpse. Another crocodile pulled the man's body out onto dry land, and that is where Luan was found when workers arrived at the farm. He was surrounded by a pool of his own blood. His arm was missing, and bite marks covered his body from head to toe. Emergency services were called, but there was nothing they could do for the farmer. He had succumbed to his injuries within minutes of the feeding frenzy. His lifeless body was surrounded by the hungry reptiles, and every time officials tried to get close to him to retrieve his body, the crocodiles hissed and snapped. One crocodile lay just meters away, a prized possession in its jaw. It was Luan's black sandal held tightly between its teeth, a trophy of sorts and a chilling reminder of the terror that must have unfolded earlier that day. When you see the basic setup of some of the world's crocodile farms, it is surprising that there aren't more incidents like this. However, just 4 years earlier, a 2-year-old girl wandered into her family's crocodile farm and was eaten alive in the very same village as Luan Nam's farm. Most of the rural farms have a distinct lack of safety measures in place and very few barriers to stop this kind of thing from happening. It took time and courage before Luan could be pulled from the enclosure by officials. Securing his body meant that now his family were now able to bury him and mourn their loss. They had begged him to sell the farm years ago, and now his business had cost him his life. After his death, Luan's family sold the farm and all the crocodiles in it, something Luan should have done years before, but tragically never did. The very thing that provided him a living all these years had ended up being the cause of his terrifying, final affliction. In the northernmost part of the planet is a frozen wilderness of pristine white, where the sun never truly sets, the Arctic. The sea here is a dark, icy mirror that reflects the northern lights as they dance across the night sky. The cold winds howl over the glaciers, carving out majestic peaks and deep valleys. The land is stony and full of extremes, where survival is a struggle against the harsh elements. Only the fittest of creatures thrive here, and among them are the kings of the Arctic, polar bears. The polar bear's snow-white fur coats blend with their surroundings, providing the much-needed camouflage during hunting. They have thick layers of fat that insulate them against the freezing temperatures. Their paws are massive, providing enough traction for traversing the icy terrain. Standing at over 9 feet tall and weighing over 900 pounds, they are a terrifying symbol of the massive extent of the Arctic. However, their population has seen a massive decline, a clear indication of human activities on the planet. This has led to a rise in the number of nature reserves and conservation agencies within the Arctic as they race to fight for the preservation of wildlife and nature in the region. Johan Kootte was a Dutch conservationist and wildlife explorer who loved animals. For years, he had lived in the most remote areas and battled with extreme weather conditions where he worked maintaining campsites for nature research and conservation groups. He had a blog where he would document his encounters in the wilderness as well as the ups and downs of living in such areas. At the height of the pandemic in 2020, Michelle van Dijk contacted Johan and offered him the job of managing the Svalbard campsite in the Netherlands. Svalbard is an archipelago located in the Arctic, only 800 miles from the North Pole, with temperatures ranging from -13 Celsius to 7 Celsius. It's one of the coldest places on the planet. The terrain is covered in a blanket of ice and snow, with the only sign of life being the hardy plants that cling to the rocky soil, Arctic wildlife, and the nature reserves, among them the one Johan was managing. This icy tundra stretches far and wide as the northern lights dance in the night sky. It is a sanctuary for rare and endangered species like the Arctic fox, Svalbard reindeer, and polar bears. Here, the polar bears not only outnumber humans, but are also the most vicious and ferocious killing machines at the North Pole. They hunt and mercilessly take down any prey that fits in their food pyramid, from the chubby sea lions and seals to the occasional human. What's worse is that the number of polar bear attacks are rapidly increasing year over year. The bears are ice dependent, and as the global temperatures rise, the ice sheets melt, making it harder for them to ambush seals. Without the ice sheets, they stand little to no chance of catching a seal while in the water. This, in return, has forced the bears to seek peculiar food sources closer to human habitation, often sighted hanging around garbage dumps, and at times they cross paths with humans, as what happened with Johan. On the evening of Thursday, the 27th August 2020, Johan stood outside his tent after a tiresome day in the freezing weather. He watched the snow-covered terrain reflect the warm colors of the setting sun. As the last rays of the sun disappeared, the purple and green auroras of the northern lights spiraled and swirled across the sky. How can such a harsh place be this beautiful? He thought to himself as he got into his tent to sleep. Inside the tent, Johan slipped into his sleeping bag and watched as the hypnotizing snowflakes danced in the soft light of his headlamp. His eyes grew heavy and his body relaxed as he gradually sunk deep into his warm sleeping bag. He slowly drifted off into sleep as the winds howled outside. The biting cold of the Arctic was not a bother as he felt at peace, lulled into deep slumber by the rhythm of nature. In the wee hours of Friday the 28th, around 4 a.m., Johan was unaware of the danger lurking outside. A massive polar bear that had breached the campsite was roaming the place. About 2 meters from the tent, the bear paused, stood on its hind legs, and tasted the chilly air. Its fur glistened in the moonlight as its glowing eyes fixed their gaze on Johan's tent. The smell of a possible meal had led it right to the tent. Sleeping, Johan didn't hear a thing as the bear approached with its paws ready to strike. And in one swipe, it tore the tent wide open from top to bottom. The bear then peeked in the tent, sniffing, throwing and spewing the tent's contents all over in an attempt to secure a meal. The commotion of the hungry bear woke Johan from his slumber. His tent had been crumpled and his items strewn over the stony, snow-covered terrain. He then saw the silhouette of the polar bear as their eyes met. For a moment, he froze. He didn't have time to slide out of his sleeping bag and run to safety. The bitterly cold air hit his face, bringing him back to reality. He quickly slid back inside his sleeping bag and zipped himself in, attempting to hide. With its mouth wide open, the bear lunged forward and clamped its jaws down on the sleeping bag. The bear's grip onto the bag allowed it to effortlessly lift and carry him. Its sharp teeth pierced the bag and tore into Johan's flesh. Johan screamed in terror as the bear began dragging him and the bag far from the tent. Unfortunately, his screams were muffled by the sleeping bag wrapped tightly around him like a cocoon. He was paralyzed with fear. Like hyenas, the scavengers of Africa, polar bears also eat their prey before killing it. Using its claws, it ripped through his clothes and sunk into his skin, leaving deep bites. The white snow stained bright red as Johan's blood spilled out. He was powerless to resist and unable to escape the deadly grasp of the bear as it relentlessly began mauling him. With a final roar, the bear swiped its claws, landing a fatal blow on Johan. Researchers and Johan's colleagues heard the growls of the bear and exited their tents armed and ready. They fired their rifles at the polar bear as it disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the echoing sound of the shots fired and a motionless body of Johan. They quickly rushed to help salvage Johan's critical condition, but they were too late. He was dead. A few hours after dawn, the body of the polar bear was discovered in the parking lot of a nearby airport. It had dragged its injured body before succumbing to the shots from the incident with Johan. At the campsite, the tent had been torn open with its contents scattered on the ground, while the sleeping bag had been dragged yards away from the tent. Johan's colleagues and the locals were deeply devastated and had to undergo counseling. Authorities emphasized on the need for locals and tourists to carry weapons when outside urban areas. Campsites were also advised to erect strong bear-proof perimeters to keep away these kings of the Arctic. After all, tents in bear territories are like tissue paper in a hurricane. They stand no chance. Since 1973, the Arctic polar bears of Svalbard have been a protected species, and shooting them is only allowed as a last resort in self-defense. In 2015, a tally conducted showed that there are approximately 1,000 polar bears in Svalbard. Today, the area is dotted with placards warning about the tenacity and savagery of polar bears. Johan's attack was the first deadly incident in 9 years and the 6th fatal encounter in 50 years in Svalbard. He never wavered in his dedication to the cause, despite the harsh conditions and the nature of his work. He was a true conservationist, driven by a deep love for nature and its protection for generations to come. The death of the polar bear would have saddened him, despite it attacking him. As a hero of the Arctic wilderness, his efforts shall live on forever after his unfortunate final affliction. The Suzhou Circus has been held at the tourist park in Sichuan County, China for decades. It is a popular attraction for tourists and the Chinese alike. The place is filled with acrobats performing amazing feats, rides, food, arcade games, and more events than anyone could fit into a single day. But on this day, the circus was closed off from the public. The staff were still reeling from a terrible loss earlier that week. One of their most experienced trapeze artists, Sun, and her husband Zhang were performing one of their daring stunts in front of a crowd of hundreds of people when Sun fell to her death. The whole ordeal was caught by the many cell phones that were recording the spectacular feats of the circus. Zhang was now with his relatives, arranging his wife's funeral, while his colleagues at the circus mourned their beloved friend's death. To say that the staff were on edge would be an understatement. Not only were they all in the throes of despair, but many of them had witnessed the incident themselves, and there was more than one member of the team dealing with trauma from the experience. But to make matters worse, the entire circus was under investigation. The constant presence of authorities and the hours of grueling interrogations that they were being put through were weighing heavily on every single member of the Suzhou team. The men and women tried their best to keep up with their daily training, making repairs to rides, and maintaining the animals in their care. Anything to keep their minds off everything that was going on. 2 days after the incident, on May 25, 2021, the team rose at 5 in the morning like they did every morning. And like always, they met up at the main gates and waited for their manager to give out the assignments for the day. Even if they were closed down while the investigation went on, there was still plenty to do. Feeding and cleaning up after the many animals the circus kept would take them most of the morning. They had monkeys, tigers, elephants, lions, bears, and pythons, not to mention goats and rabbits in the petting zoo section of the park. The bigger animals and the monkeys were strictly trained to perform all sorts of amazing feats of obedience and remarkable tricks for the public. And even the reptiles had their own exhibitions. Not only were the animals all hungry, but their cages and holdings all needed maintenance, so the team was split in two. The first group would go in to feed and water every creature, followed by a second team with their toolboxes, who who would then proceed to start oiling the hinges, relining the fences, and servicing any other part of the holdings that the animals were kept in. The second group would be able to move more freely once the carnivores were properly fed. Big cats become incredibly lazy once they've had something to eat, and even though they were all well trained and their handlers kept close by at all times, these were still wild animals, and they could be unpredictable even under the best of circumstances. Starting with the petting zoo, they moved along slowly, each animal getting bigger and bigger as they moved deeper into the park. After the petting zoo, the heavy wire gate was pulled shut behind the team, carrying wheelbarrows full of meat and feed bags. Every section of the park had this safety precaution in place. In the event that an animal did manage to slip past a handler, at least they'd be contained in the square dedicated to their holdings. Next were the buildings that held the glass tanks with snakes and lizards. After them were the monkeys and African bucks. Then came the lions, and after them came the bears. The two last members of the animal performers were the Siberian tigers and, finally, the elephants. The mistake that led to the terrible events of that day happened when the team of 6, equipped with large hunks of meat in wheelbarrows, entered the tiger enclosure. The fenced area that held the 4 magnificent creatures was high and sturdy. A single gate, with only a slip bolt action needed to open it, and no lock to secure it from intruders, stood between the people and the animals. Tigers don't have opposable thumbs, so opening a slip bolt would be virtually impossible. 2 members of the team opened the gate and started tossing the chunks of goat meat onto the grassy floor of the cage, which measured almost 10 meters in circumference. The cats did not excitedly run to the food like the other animals did. Instead, they watched the group intently, waiting for them to leave before they went forward to eat. The big cats are observant, much more so than humans give them credit for. 2 of the creatures noticed that the last man to leave was not looking down at his hands when he pulled the bolt shut. The metallic bar missed the hole by a few centimeters and instead pulled out into empty air. The gate looked shut to the distracted keepers, but just a small gust of wind would be enough to swing it wide open. 2 of the predators went forward to eat their share of their food, but the other 2, who had noticed the crew's mistake, remained laying in the grass where they were. They knew from years of habit and schedule that the humans would go to the elephants next, only to return a few minutes later. After they passed, the tigers would be left alone for the rest of the morning, and sure enough, 6 men and women walked back past them less than 10 minutes later. When the 6 staff members were finally done feeding every animal all the way to the end of the massive property, the maintenance team arrived. As the felines moved toward the gate, the bravest of the 2, a 4-year-old male, started to nervously sniff at the gate, but he backed off when the separating gate a few feet away swung open and 3 men stepped in, carrying their toolboxes and cans of lubricating oil. Momentarily confused about this break in the usual schedule, the 2 stepped back and took in the scene before they decided to act. The men paid the tigers no mind. They were heading toward the elephants at the back. Yang Yai, a 51-year-old man who had been working for the circus for over 20 years, was one of the 3 men that walked in that fateful day. He carried a toolbox in one hand, and he was lighting a cigarette with the other. He was fumbling to get his lighter back in his pocket as he was walking when he dropped the case. His tools spread across the cobblestoned walkway, and he swore loudly. His colleagues laughed good-naturedly at his blunder, and he waved them away, telling them that he'd catch up once he got all of his tools picked up. Meanwhile, the 2 tigers were watching the scene intently. They saw the 2 men walk through the next gate, leaving one behind. The man was bent over, his back facing the felines. The brave male inched forward, reaching out its paw. The gate swung open smoothly and silently at its touch. Yang did not hear a thing behind him as he puffed on his cigarette. He threw the fallen tools back into the case with so many clangs and bangs that he wouldn't have heard the gate even if it did let out a warning squeak. Slowly, the male crept forward, the older female right behind him. Both of them were low to the ground, their shoulders shimmying as they stalked the oblivious man. Neither of them had ever set foot in the wild in their entire lives, but instinct told their hungry bellies exactly what to do. They came closer and closer. Just then, one of Yang's companions looked over his shoulder, through the gate that separated them from the tiger holding. Immediately, he started screaming at Yang when he saw the stalking cats just a few feet behind him. Yang's head snapped back just as the male leaped through the air, its nails drawn at its mouth open wide. Without missing a beat, Yang whipped the hammer in his hand around. He hit the beast's claws so hard that its entire body was thrown off course. Spinning like some bizarre screeching doll, the animal crashed to the ground. But it barely hit the earth when the female behind it sprang into action herself. She launched herself at Yang, and this time he wasn't as quick as before. Yang was crouched on the ground as the animal landed on him from above. She sank her claws into his skull and shoulder, her teeth biting down right into his face. Now Yang was screaming, wildly swinging the hammer, desperate to hit some part of the ferociously clawing and biting creature. The men behind him were trapped behind the fence. If they dared open the gate, they'd have all 4 tigers on top of them. They called in for help over the radio, screaming so hysterically that the rest of the team could only make out that there were tigers loose. Every inhabitant of the park ran to the enclosure, and the police, who had just arrived for that day's set of interviews, were right behind them with their guns drawn. The situation with Yang had deteriorated drastically in the seconds it took to radio for help. The tiger was still pinned to his face, and the young male had regained its footing. It jumped back into the attack, grabbing hold of one of Yang's flailing legs. In a macabre tug-of-war, the tigers pulled and tore at the screaming man. The female's claws sliced into muscle and flesh, tearing away at the skin on his shoulder. Her other paw wrapped around his forehead, and one of her claws found an eye socket and tore his eyeball clear out of his skull, partially scalping him in the process. That's when Yang blacked out. The combination of blood loss, shock, pain, and pure terror was just too much for his system to deal with. And when his body went limp, the pair of wild animals continued to rip and tear at him with renewed urgency. When the police and the rest of the circus employees arrived at the gate, the lions and bears behind them were beating against their cages, roaring and bawling. The iron stench of blood in the air had them all in a frenzy. The police pushed the staff members aside. The situation was crystal clear. Not only was the man dead, but the remaining 2 maintenance men were trapped behind a thin wire barrier close by. The blood-crazed cats could easily scale the fences on either side. They could attack the trapped men or the staff on the opposite side, depending on which fence they scaled. The decision was made without saying a word to each other. The 5 officers raised their weapons, and the sound of gunfire rang through the circus. No fewer than 4 bullets hit the female, while the male took 6 shots. Their bodies flew back from the onslaught of firepower, and in an instant, the 2 approaching beasts behind them fled back into their cage, leaving the attackers and Yang on the cobblestones behind them. While they still had the upper hand, the officers breached the gate and slammed the 2 living tigers shut in their cage. Miraculously, the female tiger was still breathing, twitching horribly where she lay, but an officer quickly put her out of her misery with a single shot to the head. The 2 trapped men were let out, right past the remains of their friend and colleague, and the mortician was brought in to remove both Yang and his attackers. After 2 days within days of each other, the Suzhou Circus and all of its exhibitions were emptied in less than a week. The animals have been rehoused in various reserves and parks across China, and they will never see the circus again. 31-year-old Adam Stuart was an avid outdoorsman and loved the adventure of the wilderness. He worked as an outfitter at nearby Zion National Park and also as a river guide, but he did other work too. In the summer of 2014, he had been contracted by Nature's Capital, a U.S. Forest Service contractor, to carry out vegetation surveys in the Bridger-Teton National Forest. It is the third largest forest in the U.S. outside Alaska, encompassing 3.4 million acres. It stretches from Yellowstone National Park to Grand Teton National Park, taking in the Continental Divide and the mountains near the Idaho border. Adam would be conducting the field work alone, something he had expressed concerns about to his boss. He was experienced in the great outdoors and was well aware that he was entering bear country, but his concerns largely went unanswered. On the morning of September 4th, 2014, he headed to the Brooks Lake trailhead where he parked his car before walking into the forest. He carried with him his survey equipment as well as camping gear. He planned on spending the night in the field before returning to base the next day, but that would never happen. It was a sunny day. Not a cloud could be seen in the sky, but there was a chilly breeze in the air. In a few days' time, a snowstorm would sweep through the area, covering everything in a light blanket of white. But for now, it was the perfect hiking weather. It was almost 10 a.m. when Adam set off. He was renowned for his rapid hiking speed and walked briskly along the trail. He was athletic and fit, and covering many miles in one day was just part of the job. He needed to set up camp before heading to his survey site. He wore light trail running shoes, outdoors clothing, a baseball cap, and sunglasses. He was used to this work and had been assessing vegetation plots all summer. His supervisor, Stephen Rust, pinged Adam's InReach GPS to get a location on him. He could see that Adam's day's work had already begun and that he was making his way from the car park towards his campsite that morning. After 5 miles, Adam had made it to the camping spot. It was the last area of flat ground before Adam would start climbing uphill to the vegetation plot. He erected his tent, hoisted his food high up in a tree, and set off to conduct his work. The designated area for his survey was 3 miles from his campsite, and it was already mid-afternoon. It was off the beaten track, and Adam needed to traipse through thick undergrowth to get there. The trees were dense, obscuring his view. He naturally found a game trail where the vegetation was trodden down, making the progress easier. It wound through the trees and up and over fallen trunks, but this game trail was frequented by bears. Both black bears and grizzlies were numerous in the area. Adam was quiet during his hike, a dangerous thing to be when in bear country. After 1.8 miles of hiking, the trail began to head uphill. The plot site was a further mile up the hill, but Adam never made it. Unbeknown to Adam, a bear was just yards away, and even more alarmingly, Adam is walking right into its lair. The bear's food cache, consisting of 2 devoured mule deer carcasses, was hidden by leaves, twigs, and dirt. To Adam, the mounds of vegetation went unnoticed, as did a small amount of deer fur sticking out between the leaves. His line of sight was obscured by the trees, and he failed to notice a bear tucking into one of the mule deer remains. As Adam rounded the next tree, he suddenly came face to face with it. The two stood just feet apart, and he knew he had startled it. There was just one single moment, one split second, when the two of them just stared at each other, their eyes locking. But Adam was alone and unintimidating for the bear. His heart pounced in his chest. Adrenaline flooded his veins. He was in serious trouble. Instantly, the bear bounded forwards and leapt on top of Adam. His hat and glasses went flying. He was floored, landing heavily on the ground, but cushioned by his backpack. As the two grappled with one another, Adam knew that he was in the fight of his life. He didn't carry with him a firearm or bear spray. His only form of defense was his fists. The bear's immense power was pushing Adam down into the ground. He struggled to move, and he struggled to breathe as the weight of the bear bore down on him. The sharp claws sliced through his skin as it swiped at him over and over. Adam tried to keep the bear's snout away from him. He could smell the stench of its breath and hear its guttural growling as it mauled him. But it was too strong for Adam, and moments later the bear brought its jaws crunching down around Adam's skull. The attack was rapid and devastating, with one bite from its jaws exerting a bite force of more than 1,000 psi. Adam sustained unsurvivable injuries. His skull cracked, and he was gone. He was due back the next day, but it wasn't until 2 days later, September 7th, that his supervisor, Stephen Rust, notified the Fremont County Sheriff's Department that Adam was missing. An officer headed to the trailhead and located Adam's car, leaving 2 notes on it for Adam to report to the sheriff's office. But by the following day, on September 8th, there was still no sign of Adam. People were growing increasingly concerned for his welfare, and a search and rescue operation was initiated. It took a further 4 days before Adam's body was located. The search team came across his hat and glasses lying along the game trail. Then his blue backpack was sticking out from some undergrowth and a light covering of snow on the ground. Below it were his remains, largely scattered around the bear's cache. Officers from the Sheriff's Department and Wyoming Game and Fishing were notified of the discovery of Adam's remains and flew to the location, arriving at 5:30 that evening. There was very little left of Adam, and some of his remains were even buried alongside one of the 2 deer carcasses in another cache. Officers were forced to leave the area at 7:30 p.m. before the sun went down, but returned with a team of 10 people the next day. There, they conducted a full grid search, starting at the cache site and moving outwards to try and work out exactly what had happened. Inside Adam's backpack were his sampling gear for the vegetation plots and his camera. His equipment hadn't yet been used, nor any notes made in his notebook, suggesting he was on his way to the site when he was attacked. The last photo taken on Adam's camera was time-stamped 2:33 p.m., showing a picture of the cliffs along the Continental Divide. It is believed that Adam was killed shortly after he snapped that photo. From the investigative work at the kill site, it appeared that Adam had stumbled upon a bear by mistake. He had been attacked along the game trail where he died from his injuries. As the trail wound uphill, it wouldn't have been possible for Adam to see the bear until he had made it to the top of the rise, but by then it was too late. He would have likely come face to face with it less than 20 feet away. Even if he had bear spray or a weapon, there likely wouldn't have been enough time to use it. His body was then dragged over a fallen tree trunk and mostly devoured and scavenged by multiple animals over the next 8 days. There seemed to be multiple bears, as there was no evidence of mountain lions or wolves. There was evidence of both black bears and grizzlies in the area. A day bed was located just feet from one of the food caches. Bear scat and fur were dotted around the site, and footprints were numerous. Fur samples found at the site indicated that there were at least 4 different bears, 3 grizzlies, and 1 black bear. A trap was set up, but only 1 male grizzly was caught. He wasn't known to officials, and his DNA wasn't in the database for nuisance bears. Because so much time had passed since Adam had been killed, it was impossible to determine which of the bears in the vicinity, if any, were responsible. There was no sign of bear activity at Adam's campsite, and his tent was still intact. Officials could see that he had stored his food away properly. His remains were helicoptered out of the area. There was so little left of him, and his bones were so scattered around the cache that mule deer bones were accidentally collected as well. Despite the state of his body, the coroner was still able to determine that he died from blunt force trauma from a bite to his head. Following Adam's tragic death, Nature's Capital, the company he was working for, were fined $39,000, which was quickly reduced to just $13,120. The tiny sum of money seemed like an insult to all who knew and loved Adam, and his father described it as a joke, especially considering the concerns Adam had raised with his boss before leaving for the field. It was a terrible loss for Adam's family. To lose someone so young and full of life is a huge tragedy, and no amount of money would ever bring Adam back. But it was an accident that was avoidable if a few precautions had been considered beforehand. Sadly, none of them were, leading Adam Stuart to meet his terrifying final affliction.